On the Japanese. Japan was a totally unknown space to me when in 1990 I was invited to visit there with my wife as a British Council visiting scholar. When I say totally unknown, I knew that they had some interesting customs and sports and arts. Perhaps I didn't actually know where Japan was. I remember going to look at an atlas to make sure I got the place in the right place. And I suppose everything I knew could be written down on the back of one side of A4 paper easily. But I was interested in it because I'd read, one of the things I did know was that the great historian Mark Bloch had said that the only place which had the same kind of feudalism as you had in Western Europe was Japan. So there was something similar, and also obviously I might have thought, well, it's an island. It's an early industrializing island, at first in its place as England was in Europe. So perhaps I'll learn something about these phenomena from going to Japan. So we went for 6 weeks, had a wonderful time, met up with two academics, Toshiko and Kenichi Nakamura, and there began a friendship which has lasted till the present and was very intense for about 15 years. That is to say, we went to Japan and stayed with them and travelled around Japan with them half a dozen times, and they came to England half a dozen times, first to Oxford and then later to Cambridge, and every few weeks we would have a long seminar day, 1 or 2 days, where we just sit and talk and talk and talk. And this is one of the things that I learned from the Japanese experience, that if you don't speak the language or know much about the culture to begin with, the one quick way and pretty effective way to get inside the culture is to use the eyes, ears, and experience of people within it to tell you about it. Seems obvious. An outsider will never really understand another culture from the inside, and therefore if you can get close to people, and it's not just spending time talking, it's getting to know them and becoming friends, becoming close emotionally, liking them, wanting to spend time with them. It also depends on the fact that they want to spend time with you and they want to learn ideally about your own culture, so there's some sort of exchange. This is because, in a way, this kind of anthropology, which I developed from then on, was like growing up. I was an infant when I arrived in Japan. I couldn't speak the language, I couldn't perform in Japan, I knew nothing about it. And they were like my parents. They took me in hand, they taught me gently and kindly and slowly. And when I understood something, they said, "Now you understand that, Alan." When I didn't understand things, they explained them to me. And so I became at least an adolescent in that society. And I could ask questions about things which puzzled me, which interested them, because of my anthropological background, because of my comparative framework, and because as an outsider I saw things, was puzzled by things which they'd taken for granted. So it was a very productive kind of relationship, and all the time it was a matter of my guessing how Japan might be working through not only this, but through a great deal of reading of articles, books, talking to other Japan specialists, and then coming up with some theories, some ideas of how it might work, and testing it on them. And they'd say, "No, this doesn't work." And I'd sometimes say, "Well, tell me what does." And they'd say, "Well, we don't know, but we know this doesn't." So they were correcting my mistakes. And finally, after 15 years, in 2005, I sat down and wrote a version which they approved of, called Japan Through the Looking Glass. And in the process of doing all this, which I've documented in detail in a book which has been published called Discovering the Japanese or Japan, this was published a couple of years ago. In the process of doing this, I learnt a huge amount about myself and my own culture, as well as about Japan. So to isolate just one or two of these things, firstly, I realized that you can have civilizations like the English and the Japanese who are both alike and unalike. There are many features of Japanese and English social structure, economic structure, political structure, and even legal structure, which are very similar, very curiously similar, as if they were brothers, so to speak. The kinship system, the family system, the way of referring to your relatives, the terminology even, is identical, and the family systems are very different, though there's much more adoption in Japan than in England, and there isn't the romantic love complex traditionally in the same way, but it's pretty similar. The social structure is fairly similar. There's no caste system, there are no fixed hierarchical orders. The economic systems have been traditionally market, capitalist, money-based, very sophisticated tools for running a pre-industrial and then an industrial society. Both of them, as I mentioned, were the first industrializers in their respective hemispheres. Their political systems, which are decentralized and with a balance of powers traditionally in both places between the ritual and the effective rulers, the shogun and the emperor, the queen and the parliament, the land holding system, and the legal system. Wigmore, in his great study of the legal systems of the world, said that Japan and England were the only two based on a precedent-based, judge-based legal system. All the rest were different. So I realized how similar they were, but I also was struck by the fact that you could be entirely different in other aspects. Above all, culture and religion. The culture of Japan is largely taken from Korea and China, and it's absolutely diametrically opposed to the English one. That's partly why the English find it so interesting. If you look at art, aesthetics, the love of beauty, the quality of the craftsmanship, as expressed in many fields, for example in gardens, in pottery and porcelain, in house building, in the manufacture of small objects, netsuke and so on. It's totally different. The aesthetics, the traditions, the meaning, the symbolism is totally different from what I'd experienced in England. So the culture is totally different, and the ideology, the religion, is totally different. This was something that most puzzled my friend Kenichi. He would often ask me, "Alan, I don't understand your monotheistic Christian system. How does it work? How can you believe in this kind of God?" And of course I was equally puzzled by how theirs, without a God, with this odd mixture of nature religion, shamanism, called Shinto, equivalent of Taoism in China, extreme forms of Mahayana Buddhism like Zen, a belief in some sort of ancestor spirits, and above all, and a certain mixture of Confucianism into all of this, and above all, a world where nature and man were not separated. My own world seemed to be one which had evolved into, no one knows when or why or how, but basically we had disenchanted nature. Nature was physical, it was out there, it was separated from us, and spirits didn't abound. There was no magic. There were no fairies. It was neutral and dead. Some said caused by this scientific revolution, others by other things. But that's how we were. But Japan was totally different. It was filled with these forces, elemental forces, that you find in China as well, in the feng shui, the forces of the winds and the waters and the spirits, and these small, invisible but powerful entities, which are not fairies, but some sort of electric current going through, called kami. And so the religious and ideological and cosmologies were absolutely different, alongside the love of beauty, which is in many ways the central theme. If you have to choose one thing for Japan, it's beauty and aesthetic appreciation. This was totally different from my own experience. And so by looking at a world which was familiar enough that I could put my foot firmly in a bit of it, that is in the social economic world, but then explore areas of really profound difference in the ideology and aesthetics, I expanded my own views of humankind. Japan was a very large example of something which I had encountered many times as an anthropologist, reading about peoples in the Pacific or South America or Africa, worlds, tribal worlds, which were challenging my own assumptions about what was normal and right. But in those cases, you could always say, well, maybe they believe these things, but they'll soon be gone anyway. Or they're just a small mountain tribe, like the one I'd worked in Nepal. The Japanese were very similar to the Gurungs of central Nepal, but there were only 500,000 of them, and there were 120 million Japanese. So the last thing perhaps to mention is the delight of realizing that when you go to a new civilization, at first you both think, well, I understand it all anyway, because Japan looks very similar to us when you arrive at Tokyo Airport. Narita, it's just like us, and the cities look much like the Western cities on the surface. But then as you gradually go down, you enter unexpected new worlds. It's very like Alice going through the looking glass, which is why I call my book Japan Through the Looking Glass. Things begin to be reversed at first, as Alice found, and then things begin to become curiouser and curiouser, as Alice said. There are hybrids, there are anomalies, there are contradictions, because Japan is just filled with contradictions, both. And I began to realize that the thinking absorbs contradictions. We have a binary way of thought, either this or that. Japan is a both-and civilization, where you can both be this and that. Extremely flexible, extremely contextual, extremely relativistic. And all those things were very different from my own assumptions. So it had a great, exhilarating, intoxicating effect on my thought systems. Terribly difficult to understand, the most difficult place I've encountered, because the categories are so different. And yet, once you understand little bits, then you understand more. And you'll never understand Japan. It's way beyond me. But you can understand enough to bring aspects of it back to your own life and thought. And so we built a Japanese-style tea house in our garden. We have many Japanese friends, and I realized that the world would be much the poorer, much less diverse and interesting if we didn't have this civilization, which is in many respects unique and different from any other. It's worthwhile in itself. It has its great weaknesses, as we know, as well as its great strengths. But I rejoice in the fact that we have Japan.